3 true and very scary horror stories. During my childhood, my residence featured a side room located in the rear portion of the first floor. It was essentially the second living room, which is why my siblings referred to it as such. A small table, an aged recliner, and a medium-sized sofa were included. Such is it. We rarely occupied that seat. I awoke feeling ill one morning. My mother advised me to stay at home and take the day off from school after I informed her. Due to the fact that my parents were at work and my siblings were in school, I had the home to myself. I spent a few hours in bed until approximately 10:30 a.m. when I heard steady footsteps approaching from the first floor. Initially, I failed to notice the situation and presumed that my mother had simply arrived late to work, as she occasionally did. Regardless, I was in need of sustenance, so I rose to my feet and descended the stairs to the kitchen. I had approached the walk-in entrance of my kitchen for approximately 3 feet when I noticed a 6-foot-tall male dressed in tattered and torn clothing rather than my mother. I was paralyzed with dread. I simply lingered there. Although it only lasted a few seconds, it seemed like hours had passed. The individual simply observed me while standing there with no expression or anything. I eventually regained my composure and fled to my chamber located upstairs. Although I did not perceive his pursuit, I proceeded to enter my bedroom, secured the entrance, and relocated a dresser in its vicinity. I reached for my mother's phone rather than dialing 911 as I should have done. I screamed into the phone that someone was attempting to murder me inside the residence. She instructed me to remain in my room at all times and to contact the police. Thus, I did so. The police eventually arrived 15 minutes later, as I could see from my bedroom window. I ran down to them for safety after leaving my room to observe them enter the residence. I detailed everything that transpired to them. They conducted a cursory search of the residence, but discovered nothing, including no occupants, damaged windows, or doors. My parents returned home in a fit of rage shortly thereafter, the fugitive having evaded apprehension. Although I was overcome with rage, I was also incredibly fortunate to be alive. As the police commenced their preparations, one of the final officers approached to vacate and observed a Walmart bag protruding from beneath our sofa. It was that seldom utilized sofa in the side room. To which end do you refer? Under the settee, we discovered a multitude of trash bags containing rotting food that had been a week, in addition to personal items such as water bottles, wipes, and one bag containing urine. For weeks, whoever inhabited that kitchen area had been residing beneath our sofa. It is incomprehensible how none of us detected the refuse that had accumulated beneath that area during his entire presence. It truly baffles me that he managed to remain silent while submerged in that environment. Since then, we have meticulously cleansed that room and transformed it into a breakfast nook furnished with wooden chairs, thereby preventing future intruders from using them as free lodging. With my upcoming college enrollment in a few months, my apprehension regarding the recurrence of that incident will diminish significantly. I continue to reflect on it, however, each time I awaken with a wheeze. Despite appearances to the contrary, this occurred quite some time ago, likely more than a decade ago. During my senior year of high school, I was living alone at home. My parents were attending a wedding that necessitated their hotel accommodations. During that time, my sibling was employed on the night shift. Within a blue-collar neighborhood that was precariously descending, my family resided in a renowned East Coast metropolis. During my adolescent years, I tended to isolate myself. I wasn't even close to being a scholar. I once had a large social circle and frequently went on dates, but as an introvert by nature, I now value the infrequent moments of solitude I did have. I anticipated following my usual empty house routine this weekend, ordering late-night takeout, playing PlayStation on the large-screen television, and watching Dragon Ball Z. After that, I retired to the sofa with my elderly dog, Cecil. Around 2 a.m. Cecil, an elderly beagle, had been a member of our household for approximately 8 years. He resided in seclusion and tranquility, lamenting for sustenance and resting his eyes. Cecil, in contrast to most beagles, never howled. With that set aside, he had no objection to spending the night on your lap and resting his head there. At any case, it was approximately 1 a.m. I had just finished the last slice of pizza, and I was about to fall asleep on the couch when I heard a bang emanating from the back alleyway. I didn't give it much thought. It is common knowledge for city dwellers to encounter sounds occurring at any hour of the night. As Cecil's head emerged from my lap, the hair on his back also began to stand. He has always been a little timid, so I regained his composure and resumed drifting off. However, within 2 minutes I hear an additional explosion. It was something I had never witnessed Cecil do before. He ran like the wind towards the basement door, leaping from the settee, and doing so while growling and barking like a dog twice his size. His countenance evoked thoughts of a German Shepherd canine unit. His unprecedented behavior evoked a surge of adrenaline within me. Now discernible over the dog's howling is a consistent, resounding pounding. A seldom-used door in the basement provided access to the rear alleyway. It was worn and corroded, difficult to unlock even with a key, and extremely noisy. Suddenly, I became aware that an intruder was attempting to enter my home via the basement entrance. It is common knowledge among those who have not resided in a dangerous neighborhood that if someone attempts to enter your home but leaves upon realizing the door is shut, their intention was likely to steal your belongings. However, someone is obviously after you if they continue to attempt to enter your home, despite the fact that the door is locked. Acknowledging this, I promptly ran upstairs to retrieve a heavy wooden baseball bat that I had stored beneath my bed for such circumstances. I subsequently descend to my cellar. Despite the fact that I had nowhere to go and was a macho teenager with a tough man complex, I probably should have fled. As I descend the basement stairs, Cecil sprints past me with the ferocity and hostility of a dog half his age. A man's voice abruptly emits the word "oh," at which point the pounding ceases. Not calling the police or anyone else was likely the most foolish act I've ever done. The remainder of the night was spent seated upright with the bat in my hand. When my brother returned home that morning, I proceeded to describe the incident to him. As he approached the cellar door to investigate, the entire door fell off in his attempt to open it with a tug. This sociopath was only a strong push away from entering my home, but old Cecil managed to deter him. That obese, sluggish senior dog almost certainly saved my life. When I relate the story to others, they rationalize his behavior as that of an ordinary dog going about its daily business. However, I can assure you that Cecil never before barked or moved so quickly. It was as though he were acutely aware of the urgency and that the door was about to open. Several years ago, it became necessary to put him to sleep because he no longer had any desire to live. I had a moment alone with him prior to the injection, during which I expressed my gratitude once more for his friendship and for everything he had done that night. I was an adult man with a spouse and children at this time, but I am certain that none of that would have occurred if not for old Cecil. I was about 13 years old when the story was set. Despite the fact that I continue to reside in this home, I remain uncertain as to what this was. As our neighborhood was situated in Tornado Alley, I always slept downstairs in my father's room as an extra precaution during the onset of a tempest. As a result of my heavy sleeper tendencies, I was seated on my smartphone at 12:43 a.m., engrossed in YouTube content, while the rain besieged my residence. My father's intense vehicle base could be heard approaching the driveway. In the small town where I grew up, everyone knew one another, and he was the only one with that type of automobile. Since he had been working the entire night, I presumed he would be coming downstairs to sleep. As a result, I gathered my belongings and my dog and waited at the edge of the bed. Following a brief period of anticipation, I proceeded to approach the window that was directly oriented towards the driveway. Given that I could see the entire driveway through this window, it was inconceivable that any vehicle in the driveway would remain hidden. Nonetheless, there was no vehicle present. Nothing was present. I reasoned that I had possibly confused it with a vehicle traveling by on the highway next to us. As I recalled that my father had also estimated that he would not return home until 2 a.m., I returned to my seat after walking over. But I immediately noticed that the bass from the vehicle continued to reverberate in the driveway. I was initially alarmed, but in the end, I didn't give it much thought because it seems that people frequently park in an arbitrary manner around residences. After a brief interval, I became aware of my father's coughing in the garage. I was relieved that he appeared to be at home, as the tempest was intensifying. However, my fear increased even further when I realized I had not heard the garage door open. I waited because I was too frightened to peer out the window once more. A few minutes later, the rain was now more intensely striking the house, and the thunder and lighting were becoming increasingly bright and audible. My father gently called out my name in his voice. I immediately realized that someone or something was inside my residence. I had become immobile while listening. I turned and observed my dog's bewildered expression toward me, as if he had not heard anything. I returned to my seat gradually and then lay as still and silently as possible until I passed out. At 4 a.m., I arose, hurried to the window, and upon spotting my father's vehicle, I descended the stairs. I detailed everything that had transpired to him. Although I am not the type to believe in spirits, I had the feeling that that night, something other than my father had called my name. 3 true close encounter horror stories. Since it occurred a few weeks ago, this has not been able to fade from my memory. I recently moved into a modest apartment complex, a few miles from my parents' residence when I was 20 years old. Having never lived alone before, I was quite unfamiliar with the circumstances at hand. The 3-story complex comprised a grand total of 6 residences. Since the sole available option was situated on the upper floor, I was compelled to select it. In any case, I completed everything and was able to unwind for a short while before retiring for the night. It was probably around 10 p.m. at that point, but I still needed to make my bed and prepare supper. Ramen being the only item I truly needed to eat, I ignited a pot of water over the stovetop and brought it to a boil. I faintly heard the floor in front of my apartment tremble as I awaited. Initially, I was uncertain as to whether the complex was merely making sounds or whether someone was at my door. I figured that, as a matter of course, I ought to investigate in case anyone was present. "Hello," I murmured faintly as I cautiously opened the door to find an elderly man standing a few feet away with his back to me. As the door to the adjacent apartment was directly in front of mine, which was the direction he was facing, I presumed he resided there. After a few seconds had passed, he gently turned and apologized before beginning to descend the stairs. I shut the door and proceeded to inspect the water in the container. I began to feel a little apprehensive, primarily due to the fact that he did not enter the adjacent room. Unless you resided on the upper floor, there would be no reason for anyone to ascend that level. I concluded the preparation of the ramen and endeavored to maintain a minimal mental focus on it. Simply put, I was ecstatic to have my very own apartment and to be living independently for the first time. This was a significant achievement for me, and I didn't want my first night be frightened out of. As a result, I completed my bed making and turned off all the lights. I remained awake on my smartphone for a brief period of time before drifting off. I would say that I went to slumber between 11 and 12, but I cannot be certain. Nevertheless, I recall waking up at 1:29 and glancing at the time after hearing something from the room beneath mine. The sound resembled the gentle shuffling of feet. As I lay there, I awaited any further information. It was approximately 5 minutes before I once more heard the floor groaning from outside my room. I was experiencing a mild case of panic as I frantically ruminated on whether or not I had locked the door after regaining access to it earlier that evening. I heard the subtle clicking sound of the doorknob, attempting to be turned as I waited in silence. A latch was on it. A few seconds later, as I awaited the outcome, I was relieved to hear the neighbor's door briefly open and close. I returned to bed after rapidly confirming that my front door was locked upon emerging from bed. I deduced that the elderly gentleman may have become disoriented and misidentified which door belonged to him. As dawn approached, a resounding pounding emanated from my front door. 2 police officers awaited my arrival. They inquired whether I had encountered any peculiar occurrences or if anything was absent the night before. Last night, it appears that 2 apartments were robbed by a man who neglected to secure their doors. I disclosed everything to the officers, who then declined my gratitude and descended the stairs. It is uncertain whether the subject was located, but since then, nothing has transpired. I am uneasy just thinking about the circumstance as a whole, and I cannot help but ponder the consequences of forgetting to lock the door that night. My house was situated at the end of a low-traffic neighborhood road that ran up against a sizable forest when I was 10 or 11 years old. Behind my house, I would frequently run around, play games, and go for walks with my pals. Compared to other wooded areas and forests I've encountered, this one appeared to be the densest. In certain areas of the forest, the proximity of the trees made it difficult to walk alongside a companion without having to continually move in front of or behind them to pass between 2 trees. In any case, since there was no school tomorrow, it was a typical Friday evening, and I invited my closest friend over for a social gathering. As soon as he arrived, the sun had already started to set. Nevertheless, we desired to spend some time in the woods before it became too dark. We lighted some powerful torches as a precaution and made our way towards the trees. 10 to 15 minutes into our journey, we came across a fallen tree on which we rested and conversed. One of our favorite activities was simply sitting in the woods and conversing about whatever we were feeling. It is uncertain for how long we remained seated there. However, it is evident that we became engrossed in conversation for a considerable duration, as the forest was nearly entirely enveloped in darkness by the time I noticed it. Both of us were initially at ease because we were familiar with our way through the forest and reasoned that we would simply begin our way back before it became completely dark. We activated our lanterns and commenced our journey. Although I must confess it, I was certainly a little unnerved. Aside from the crunch of our footfall through the leaves, it was almost completely silent, and the dense trees obscured our vision to within a few feet in front of us. We both came to a sudden halt after 2 to 3 minutes of walking, when we detected the distinct sound of an individual strolling slowly through the leaves in front of us. They were probably concealed behind foliage no more than 15 to 20 feet in front of where we were standing. I found myself unable to suppress my curiosity regarding the motivations behind an individual venturing into the forests alone at this hour of the night. The footsteps ceased just as we believed the individual was beginning to recede, despite my best efforts to maintain composure. Both my companion and I froze. Each of us regarded the other with trepidation and bewilderment. It appeared as though the entire environment had abruptly ceased to be audible. As I stood there and observed my friend, a warm sensation coursed through my body, as if I were suddenly and perilously exposed. A fraction of a second later, I caught the sound of leaves crunching from only a few feet behind us. Upon being prompted by my instincts, I immediately began to run in the exact direction of my residence. My shoulders frequently collided with the trees as I ran, finding it difficult to traverse them due to the dim illumination. Behind me, I could hear footfall crunching the leaves. I could only hope it was my companion, but I was too terrified to turn around. Approximately 30 seconds into my run, I detected the footfall making a sharp right turn before dissipating into the distance. This made me even more terrified that those were not my friend's footsteps, and it prompted me to ponder where my friend was and whether or not he was in danger. I eventually arrived at my backyard and entered my residence through the rear entrance. I was unable to breathe. As I peered through the windows in anticipation of my friend's arrival, my concern grew significantly after a few moments had passed. My parents inquired about my well-being upon descending the stairs and noticing the distressed expression on my face. As I continued to explain everything to them, the front doorbell of our residence rang. My father hesitantly ajar the door. My friend pushed the door open promptly and dashed inside. He stated that he froze in position, unsure of what to do, after I ran. A few moments after he noticed 2 sets of footprints following me in my direction, he also made the decision to run towards my residence. Despite the fact that my parents reported the incident to the police, nothing came of it. To this day, my friend and I continue to discuss it and generate new hypotheses regarding what actually transpired that evening. A portion of me wishes I had turned around to see who was pursuing me, but I am certain that in that forest, I could not have taken 5 steps before colliding with a tree. In any case, that remains the most horrifying experience of my life, and ever since then, I have always felt apprehensive when I was in the vicinity of a forest at night. The evening was a Saturday. My companions and I were preparing to attend the opening act of the music night at a local pub. Time slipping through our fingers, we realized we had to depart immediately in order to avoid missing it. I hurriedly gathered my keys and pocketbook, and we both hurriedly exited the residence and entered my vehicle. Fortunately, we arrived at the establishment in time to witness the performance. Surprisingly, upon palming my pockets after a few alcoholic beverages, I was unable to locate my phone. I combed through each compartment and inquired with each of my peers regarding its whereabouts, but it remained undiscovered. They assisted me in navigating the bar in the vicinity of every table and the areas we had visited. We ultimately gave up and attempted to dial it using one of my friend's phones. Following 2 chimes, an individual answered the phone. "Hello?" I greeted. On the other end of the line, we could hear them breathing, although they did not speak. I resumed speaking after a brief pause, but they hung up immediately thereafter. Although I was annoyed that my phone had been stolen, I resolved to address the matter tomorrow, since it was growing late. and there was little I could do about it at the moment. After leaving the bar approximately an hour later, I dropped off my companions at their residences and began my way back to my own. As I drove, my mind raced as I recalled the last time I carried my phone with me. As I approached the driveway, I reflected on the previous occasion I recalled having my phone in my bed. It was as I was preparing to depart. The more I contemplated it, the more uneasy it became to become. As I exited my vehicle, I approached the front door, unlocked it, and entered with caution. With a deliberate pace, I proceeded to the bedroom and initiated the illumination. Undoubtedly, my phone was situated precisely where I believed it had been, on the bed. I searched the entire residence for any indication that someone had been inside, but to no avail. That evening, I had difficulty sleeping due to my aversion to even the slightest sound. The following day, I told my friends about it, and they all concurred that it was unsettling. In addition, we ultimately reached the consensus that contacting the police would likely be ineffective, so we decided to end the matter there. 3 very horrifying Airbnb stories. At the conclusion of April, I was in the process of relocating from my residence in Chicago to Nevada. To facilitate the process of moving into the new residence, I contracted with a company to transport all the crates I had. My objective was to travel there by car, spend a few days unwinding en route, and possibly check into hotels or Airbnbs. Determining that the entire journey would take approximately 30 hours, I divided that time in thirds and devised a plan to drive for 10 hours daily with an overnight stopover. Upon careful time management, I determined that my initial sojourn should be situated on the periphery of Nebraska. Nebraska wasn't exactly a tourist destination, so all I wanted was a place to stay for 8 hours before continuing my journey. In search of something inexpensive, I perused Airbnb. A modest single-story residence featuring 2 chambers was discovered. Despite the fact that I didn't require the 2 bedrooms, I didn't mind the additional space because the price was so reasonable. Nevertheless, I found it somewhat peculiar that the displayed images were limited to a single chamber. Nevertheless, its impact on my perception was negligible. Consequently, I scheduled it for the following evening and prepared for bed. I began the journey in the morning after completing the loading of my vehicle with the remaining items contained within. I departed slightly later than intended, but I reasoned that driving for several hours in the dark wouldn't be too much of a problem. It is evident to anyone who has driven through Nebraska that the state is extremely flat. There are vast stretches spanning hundreds of miles, devoid of any structures or illumination. After several hours had passed since dusk, I arrived at the Airbnb. I had deviated from the lengthy, deserted road and descended a narrow gravel pathway. At first, I was a little bit dissatisfied because the exterior appeared considerably more worn down than the images had depicted. I merely reminded myself that my stay would be for a few hours to sleep, so the situation was not overly significant. After preparing a few of my belongings, I made my way to the front door. Typically, the proprietors provide the passphrase and place the key in a key box. However, this door lacked a key box. Indeed, it was devoid of any lock whatsoever. It was one of those standard doorknobs found on pantry doors. Although I began to feel a little apprehensive, I was compelled to remain there because I had no other choice. I entered the establishment and was taken aback to find that, to my pleasant surprise, the interior was quite comfortable. Although the space was modest, the living room and kitchen appeared to be well maintained and furnished. Upon entering the first bedroom, I observed that it too lacked a lock. Fortunately, the second bedroom had everything, so I chose to unpack there. But there was one thing about this bedroom that truly unnerved me. A small, perhaps 2-foot wide, antiquated doorway hung on the wall directly in front of the bed. It measured about 3 feet in height. This is the photograph that I actually captured of the room's entrance. I became increasingly uneasy the more I regarded this door, but I could not remain in a room that I was unable to secure. I attempted to open it in order to inspect what was concealed behind it, but it was locked from the exterior. Nevertheless, the door gave me the shivers, despite my assumption that the proprietor had merely stored extra towels or cleaning supplies there. However, I was becoming quite exhausted, so I unpacked only the essentials for the evening and began preparing for bed. During the wee hours of the morning, I awoke to the sound of a gentle rapping sound emanating from the extremity of the bed. It was extremely subtle, but with the exception of the striking, the entire house was silent. I grasped my phone haphazardly from the nightstand and hurriedly activated the illumination. As I directed the light toward the bed's edge, the tapping ceased. I am not the type to be readily frightened. I will experience mild discomfort or anxiety, but never fear. However, that moment in the narrow doorway at the end of my bed evoked a profound sense of fear within me. I arose from bed, flipped the lights on, gathered my belongings, and made a hasty exit from the residence. As I reversed my car out of the gravel path at night, despite the fact that it was still extremely dark and I could not see much, I believe I noticed a man lying on the ground behind the house. Approximately 30 minutes after driving down the road, I pulled over and texted the proprietor to alert him that someone may have entered his residence and to contact the police. After a couple of hours of driving along the road until I reached a small town, I retreated to the parking lot of a grocery store in order to get some rest. The most unsettling aspect was that when I checked my phone in the morning, it said my message had been read mere minutes after I sent it, but the Airbnb host had not replied. I am still uncertain as to what transpired at that location. My significant other and I were spending a few days in Michigan to see my parents, but for obvious reasons, we did not wish to remain with them. 15 minutes away from their residence, we discovered a charming one-bedroom condominium listed on Airbnb. As a result of the modern, entirely redone interior, it was not the most affordable. Although the hosts appeared to be pleasant and received high ratings, a few of the comments aroused red flags. The majority of the adverse remarks detailed peculiar encounters with the neighbor. Having experienced some eccentric neighbors in the past, I am not inclined to pass judgment. I simply brought it up with the host prior to making a reservation, and she informed me that her neighbor is inquisitive and becomes defensive when individuals attempt to enter the Airbnb. However, she assured us that she will inform the neighbor about our presence and appearance, so everything ought to be in order. Everything ran efficiently on the day we arrived. We encountered the host, who resided in close proximity, and she bestowed upon us the entryway key and the code for the apartment itself. After unpacking our belongings, we proceeded to my parents' residence for supper. In order to cope with my mother, I consumed a few drinks during the course of the evening. Before we knew it, it was already 10 p.m., and it was time to return to the Airbnb. We approached our rental vehicle. Presently, every complex comprises 4 residences, with 2 situated at the base and 2 at the top. Our accommodation was situated in the upper left. Upon approaching, however, we noticed a diminutive figure silhouetted against the draperies in the upper right window of the apartment. Suddenly, I began to feel odd. Who simply gazes at their window in such a manner? As my companion parked and I emerged, I re-examined the situation and saw that she was still standing there, staring at us. As we approached the entrance together, I was able to discern her features. Do you recognize those individuals who have that insane look on their face? She appeared as follows. Brown hair in disarray and wide-eyed. She was at least 60 or 70 years old, and that frown, I have never seen someone so irate, was unfathomable. As soon as my partner inserts the key into the door and we proceed inside, we are not surprised to see her atop the staircase. She remains motionless while observing us. Despite the fact that she is petite and round, it was evident from her stance that her arms and thighs were extremely slender. Upon exchanging glances, my significant other and I proceeded to ascend the stairs together. We approached while she fixed her menacing gaze on us. However, to my surprise, she remained silent and simply regarded us with those unsettling eyes. My boyfriend entered the code while we hurriedly entered the apartment. I kept glancing back. "What the hell was that?" my fiancé asked softly as he regarded me in disbelief. I simply nodded my head in relief that she did not attempt to engage in conversation with us. The remainder of the night passed without any unusual occurrences until we heard a knock at the front door. I abruptly arose from bed to discover that my significant other was already awake. The pounding continued nonstop for approximately 1 to 2 minutes before it abruptly ceased. Upon checking my phone, the time was almost 4 a.m. At this moment, who would be pounding on the door? As my significant other approached the door, he murmured to me that he was peering through the peephole to determine who was inside. I followed him sluggishly during his inspection. He glanced back at me while visibly perplexed. He then slightly opened the door to take in his surroundings, and I overheard him exclaim, "What?" I murmured as I approached him cautiously, What was spread out on the greeting mat by the door? Rat carcasses. They appeared to be completely mutilated, with only one retaining its cranium. We both agreed to contact the host later that day after he shut the door. Despite my earnest attempts to fall asleep, the recollections of those rodents persisted in my thoughts. I eventually checked my phone and saw that the time was 6:30. Recognizing that it would be impossible for me to sleep, I arose to prepare coffee. I heard the neighbor's door slam shut as I did so. In an attempt to catch a glimpse of the insane woman, I peered out the kitchen window that overlooks the parking lot. To my surprise, there she was, standing and gazing at our parked vehicle. Without even examining the contents, she was fixated on it. After having been preoccupied with her vehicle for an extended period, she gradually cocked her head in my direction. I momentarily averted my gaze and was greeted with her horrifying, blood-curdling wail, which sounded as though she were under attack. Obviously alarmed, my significant other bolted from the bedroom, and we both peered out the window once more. The neighbor, who was standing there with her head held high and yelling at the driver's side window, grabbed the top of the car and began banging her head while saying, "They never leave. When will they leave? And why do they keep coming?" My boyfriend and I began recording for insurance purposes, at which point he contacted the host and the police. She was lying on the ground next to her vehicle, which had sustained minimal damage in light of what we had just witnessed, when the police arrived. The host apologized sincerely, stated that this had never occurred before, and issued a full refund for our journey. We were able to witness the woman being handcuffed away, although she was reluctant to comply at first. It remains unknown what caused her condition. However, my conjecture is that something abruptly malfunctioned, and our mere presence at the time coincided with the incident. However, it is important to note that each review should be duly considered when making a reservation on Airbnb. Each and every one. A few years ago, when my companions and I had just completed our sophomore year of college, this occurred. As the academic year came to a close after several months, we desired to commemorate a bit as we began our summer vacation. We all had part-time employment in the vicinity of campus, which allowed us to accumulate funds. We all decided to spend a few days in Las Vegas, a place none of us had ever been before, in an extravagant fashion. Initially, we searched for a hotel in the city that was both reasonably priced and sufficiently spacious to accommodate the four of us. We ultimately abandoned that and began searching for Airbnb accommodations, the majority of which were more spacious and less expensive. Several were considered, but in the end, we selected the largest one that offered the most accommodations. Following a few weeks, our Uber arrived at our residence after transporting us from the airport. Everything appeared even more enormous in reality, and we were all extremely excited to spend the following few days here. We all unpacked and unwindowed for a couple of hours, as the flight had left us feeling slightly exhausted. I was alone in the darkness until my friend Alyssa and I were a few hours after sunset. At 8 or 8:30 it was still not too late, but the other two individuals had chosen to retire early to their beds. Alyssa, who was essentially without activities to do, suggested that they take a stroll outside and investigate the neighborhood. I concurred, enthusiastic about observing the one-of-a-kind residences. It is worth noting that our Airbnb accommodation was quite pleasant, and the adjacent residences were equally so. There was nothing suspicious about this street, so we didn't give it a second thought before going for a stroll. We ascended the street and exited the building. Following the passage of 6 or 7 houses, the road abruptly turned and joined another intersecting road flanked by residential properties. However, it was peculiar because these residences were in no way similar to those we had just passed on our street. Not intending to be impolite in any way, but these appeared to be dilapidated shacks. It was truly peculiar to see such an abrupt change in dwellings after barely rounding the corner. As we progressed, we observed several shattered windows, absent mailboxes, and even worn-out vacant signs affixed to a number of the doors. A settee chair with tears and stains was even positioned in the exact center of the front yard of one of the residences. We agreed to return to our Airbnb via the next turn, but a few minutes later, we noticed a small SUV with its headlamps off approaching us from down the road. It slowing down as it approached and eventually coming to a complete stop directly next to us. Approximately 50 to 60 years old, an elderly woman rolled down the window and exclaimed, "You two are such a cute couple," while making extremely strange jerky head and arm movements, and behaving extremely oddly. I replied, "Thank you." in an effort to swiftly conclude the conversation and convince her to depart. Fortunately, it succeeded. Similar to her, we proceeded in the opposite direction along the road. We followed the next turn after a brief delay and returned to the street with our Airbnb. Both of us were profoundly alarmed and uneasy by the entire situation, and yearned to retreat inside and forget about it. However, as we approached the driveway, the elderly woman's SUV reversed course and resumed its approach towards us. Unlike the last time, when she stopped in front of the home when we were halfway up the driveway, this occasion was somewhat different. She simply regarded us. She neither spoke nor displayed any emotion on her countenance. She was merely fixated. As Alyssa hurriedly entered, I followed suit. As I was closing the rear door, I detected the vehicle continuing down the road. We determined that she had not returned by securing every door and inspecting every window for a brief period of time. We concluded that everything was likely in order an hour later, so we returned to our accommodations and prepared for bed. We told our other companions what had transpired the following day, and they were similarly alarmed. Ultimately, we disclosed the entire situation to the Airbnb proprietor, and we even requested that our third day be canceled in order to depart earlier. He graciously obliged. We resolved to spend the remainder of that day exploring the city in an effort to make the most of at least one of our days in Las Vegas worthwhile. Although we ultimately enjoyed ourselves immensely as the evening drew to a close, we were both prepared to hail an Uber and return home. A picture was attached to a text message from the proprietor that inquired, "Is this the woman from last night?" as I was returning in the vehicle. Upon opening it, I observed a screenshot of the woman standing outside the residence captured by the Ring doorbell footage. I responded to the proprietor and showed it to all of my acquaintances immediately. We were at a loss for what to do and requested that the driver transport us to a hotel parking lot located a few blocks away from our residence, while the proprietor contacted law enforcement. The proprietor called me after approximately 45 minutes to inform me that the house was secure and we could return. However, he mentioned that the woman had not been located by the police. Clearly, none of us felt any better as a result. As soon as we arrived at the residence, we began packing promptly so that we could depart early the following morning. Although nothing occurred the night before or the following morning, it is certain that none of us had a restful night's slumber. We hurriedly exited the location and continued our way to the airport. This was without a doubt one of the most peculiar occurrences of my life, and I continue to reflect on it frequently. One piece of advice that I can offer is to consistently inspect the vicinity of your Airbnb accommodation prior to making a reservation. 3 horror stories on the night shift. My workplace is a Montessori school, which is essentially a minuscule institution consisting of 3 to 4 extremely small classrooms for the students. The classrooms are located on the lower level of a church, and it is my responsibility to clean them each evening following each class. While the task of cleaning all the rooms would have taken me approximately 2 hours, I was required to work the closing shift at a nearby grocery store, which resulted in my arrival at the school around 10:30 on most evenings. It is noteworthy to mention that the parking lot adjacent to the church was shared with an elderly residence situated directly across from it. Undoubtedly, this educational institution has witnessed numerous peculiar and unsettling occurrences. However, within the past few weeks, something particularly peculiar and unsettling has transpired. As soon as I completed tidying the second room, I started transferring my cleaning supplies to the third. At this point, it was approximately 11:45, which meant I was running a little behind schedule and therefore attempting to hurry. While traversing the corridor leading to the third chamber, I caught a resounding sound of resounding bells reverberating through the upper level of the church. The doorbell had been rang by an individual. Prior to this, no one ever arrived for any of my duties, as it was incessantly late and the church and school had already ceased operations hours beforehand. A little uneasy, I made my way cautiously up the stairs and in the direction of the door. It was one of those wooden entrances adorned with enormous panes of tinted glass. In an effort to remain undetected, I peered around the corner to observe who was outside. Probably in her 70s or 80s, I observed an elderly woman standing directly outside the entrance. It was before she could notice me that I withdrew. I chose to disregard it, assuming that she had simply wandered off and that one of the senior living facilities personnel would retrieve her. I resumed my cleaning duties by mopping the room's floors, but a few moments later, I heard a resounding explosion reverberate throughout the corridors. After a brief moment of jumping, I halted to listen. A few seconds after the banging ceased, the elderly woman could be heard shouting from outside. Due to the difficulty in understanding her words, I returned to the upper level, where I could audibly discern her plea. She was requesting the presence of an individual by the name of Abby. She was simply reiterating her name incessantly. As I approached the entrance, the woman came to a stop. Upon rounding the corner, I noticed that she was no longer standing outside the door. Although it was slightly disconcerting, I consoled myself with the knowledge that someone had likely arrived to retrieve her upon hearing her screams. As I began to make my way back, I noticed the elderly woman gazing at me through the window adjacent to the stairs from the periphery. She glared directly at me and exclaimed, "Abby, assist me!" Her hair was long and gray, and she had wide open eyes. I hurriedly descended the stairs and promptly secured myself in one of the classrooms. I called the senior living facility adjacent to us on my mobile device and informed them of the situation, inquiring whether she had possibly strayed from their vicinity. The woman on the line informed me that everyone was present. Since they are required to check out, they would have noticed if anyone had departed. She stated that, just in case, she would verify with security and advised everyone to remain on the line. A few seconds after, I heard pounding on the window upstairs and waited. The woman on the phone identified the elderly woman by her features and inquired whether it belonged to her. I concurred and added that she continues to call for an individual by the name of Abby. A brief moment of silence ensued. "Ma'am," I responded gently over the phone. She responded by cautioning me against approaching her and advising me to seek refuge in a secure location until assistance could be dispatched to retrieve her. Clearly, this increased my fear even further. I remained in the room, continuing to hear the recurrent thuds on the window from the upper level. Given the age of the structure, it was uncertain how long those windows would remain in good condition if she continued to strike them. Eventually, masculine voices emanated from the exterior, and they departed following what appeared to be a struggle. I remained motionless for several minutes, ruminating on the events that had transpired. I subsequently rose and completed cleaning the chambers. The entire incident seemed almost fantastical, and the mere knowledge that the elderly woman is in the building opposite me continues to elicit anxiety in me. Regardless of the identity of Abby or the motivations behind the woman's attempt to enter the church, I remain cautious about unlocking the door. I used to work the register at a local gas station, but I've since resigned because working overnight resulted in a number of peculiar occurrences. But this specific circumstance will remain with me indefinitely. I typically worked the night shift on Fridays and Saturdays, and only a few other days per week. My shifts were typically tedious and essentially a struggle to remain alert. Essentially, my responsibilities entailed stocking the shelves and providing sporadic assistance to customers. There were a few instances of families or drunk individuals visiting during road trips, and on occasion, entire groups of friends as well. But it was generally quite peaceful. Around 2 a.m. on this particular evening, I had been without a customer for more than an hour, and as a result, I was beginning to feel a little sleepy. As the desk was situated in close proximity to the entrance and a doorbell was installed to indicate when an individual entered, the act of falling unconscious was not typically a significant challenge. A few seconds after awakening to the sound of the doorbell ringing, I noticed a customer enter the establishment. Evidently a typical 30-year-old, he entered the establishment in search of a beverage or a snack. He strolled down each aisle for a short while, observing everything. Now that I have extensive experience in retail, I am aware of the appearance that takes place when a customer is seeking a particular item, but this individual was not considering it. While perusing the store, he was merely observing the shelves. This is fairly typical during the day, but not at 2 a.m. when few individuals are present to peruse the gas station shelves. I peered out the left window to determine whether he was filling up his vehicle or simply slaying time. However, there were no vehicles visible outside. After a few moments, he eventually turned to me, expressed gratitude, and exited the room. I was perplexed as to what to make of that, but I surmised that he had stolen something minor and was merely being facetious. A short while later, the entire incident escaped my thoughts, and I began to feel extremely exhausted once more. As a diversion, I chose to this time retrieve my cart of items to stock and commence the process of stocking the shelves. I estimate that I was stalking for no more than 20 minutes when I noticed a man approaching from the end of the aisle that I had been observing. I was slightly startled because I did not hear the doorbell chime. This individual was attired in somber clothing and a large hoodie. I immediately became acutely aware that something was noticeably amiss. As soon as the man descended to the store's rear, I returned to my position behind the counter. I attempted to refrain from staring, but I could tell he wasn't searching for anything as he walked down the aisles. He was merely perusing. It occurred to me immediately that this individual was the same as the one I had just seen moments earlier, albeit in a different outfit. I also came to the conclusion that he likely arrived to conduct a preliminary reconnaissance of the area prior to carrying out his intended mission. An internal state of dread ensued within me. As the individual descended the aisle nearest to the counter, I noticed a substantial item concealed within the front pocket of his hoodie. "Welcome back, sir," I said, in an attempt to avert a further escalation, having made a split-second decision to do so. Unable to locate anything? He maintained visual contact with me, and it was evident that he fully comprehended my intention. He silently approached the counter before removing his hand from his pocket and displaying a compact handgun. He then deposited a small pack of gum in front of me after removing it from the counter. He responded with, "Just this," bewildered and stunned by the unfolding events. I remained motionless for only a few seconds before examining the gum with anxiety. While still holding the firearm, he removed $1 from his pocket of jeans, tossed it on the counter, expressed gratitude, and exited. I was in disbelief and desperately attempted to comprehend what had just transpired. The incident was ultimately reported to the police, and I attempted to contact my superior but received no answer. Although the situation never yielded any updates, it consumed my thoughts and feelings during my final few months of employment there. Honestly, although I still do not know what transpired that night or what the man intended, I am relieved that I never discovered the truth. I am an analyst of cybersecurity for a sizable office supply company in my community. Naturally, as I had just begun my first employment in the industry, I was required to work the shift that no one else desired. However, working overnight was not as dreadful as I had anticipated. In actuality, it was quite tranquil. My primary responsibility was to examine log files to ensure that nothing suspicious occurred while the rest of the crew slept. As a consequence, I frequently found myself in the office complex alone for multiple hours. Due to the strain on my eyes caused by staring at a screen for hours in the middle of the night and the lack of companionship, I frequently fell unconscious. Maintaining consciousness during this time proved to be quite challenging. I initiated the practice of programming hourly gentle alarms on my mobile device in order to prevent myself from dozing off for the duration of my work shift. I had been employed at this location for approximately 4 months at the time of this incident. I am still employed there at this time. A routine evening had passed, and my colleague had just exited the building after completing his duty at 12 o'clock. After resuming my duties and turning on the coffee machine a few moments later, I descended the main corridor for a general survey of the building to determine whether or not anyone was still present. It was a habitual practice of mine to establish a sense of comfort for myself. I returned to my station, retrieved my phone to activate the alarms, and proceeded with my work thereafter. 20 minutes later, I went to check on the coffee machine after realizing I had not heard it indicate completion with a sound. As I descended the hallway to the small coffee kiosk, I observed that the coffee pot was empty and the machine as a whole was in the off position. It was strange, but that was about it. I simply reactivated it and returned to my workstation. I immediately observed upon sitting down that my phone had vanished from the desk next to my keyboard, where I had left it. After ruffling my pockets and hastening to the coffee desk, I discovered that it was once again absent. Upon recalling it, I was certain that I had placed it directly on my desk, adjacent to my keyboard. I began to experience extreme panic and began to glance around frantically. The configuration of my desk placed it in the exact center of a sizable room containing numerous computers and workstations. I experienced a sense of surveillance as I stood in the center, certain that another individual was compelled to be present alongside me. I frantically yelled at my friend in a trembling voice, desperately hoping he was just attempting to prank me. I awaited a response for several seconds without receiving one. A few seconds later, as I continued to stand by my desk, I detected a faint shuffling emanating from the far corner behind the desk. My phone alarm rang from the opposite corner of the room almost immediately thereafter. Immediately upon realizing that there were likely two unidentified strangers in the room with me, I began to dash for the building's exit. Having made my way out, I did not hear any footsteps behind me, but I refrained from taking any chances. I dashed across the street to a nearby gas station, where I utilized their phone to dial 911 and report the unidentified individuals who had entered our office building. The police arrived quicker than I thought and searched the building. They brought out a man after only a few minutes, though I didn't recognize him at all. Additionally, they recovered my phone, which they discovered concealed behind some boxes in an office corner. He was also discovered with a small knife in his pocket. The next day, we received a lot more information about what really took place. Apparently, the man was an old employee who had been fired recently before I began working there.